Section 4 of Strangers at Lisconnel by Jane Barlow. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 4. At the time of Denis O'Meara's arrival, he was darning the widow Joyce's thatch for her, and not killing himself over the job, as people said, when they reckoned how many days he had been visible crawling about on top of her little house, a conspicuous position in which he looked, Mrs. Conryan remarked, a queerer great gawk than he did on dry land. He was occupied thus on the first afternoon that Denis walked up there with some of the other lads, and while they talked to Mrs. Joyce and Teresa underneath, the thatcher took a leisurely and critical survey of the scarlet and golden newcomer, from his wonderfully polished boots to his sleek dark head and fierce moustache. The verdict he pronounced to himself with unfeigned satisfaction was, "Grandeur's no name for him." Hugh himself, of large and lumbering frame, had a shag of reddish flaxen hair, which made thatch-like eaves above his small light blue eyes and high burnt brick-coloured cheek-bones. He wore whitey brown rags. After the rest had gone on and in, he slithered down to the ground and told Teresa, who was still standing by the door, that she didn't look the size of a bit of a ladybird beside the soldier fellow. If anybody else had made this personal remark, Teresa might have been a little hurt by it, as she wished herself of more imposing stature. But sure nobody minded poor Hugh McInerney. At any rate, she said, "Aye, he's a terrible big man, isn't he? Apt to knock the head off himself he'd be if he was offerin' to come in at our door." However, on the next day Denis contrived to accomplish that feat without any such accident when he called in at the Joyces' to ask was his grandmother there, which she was not, nor indeed likely to be. Failing to find the old woman, he postponed his quest for the present, and stayed talking to Teresa, who, as it happened, was at home. And then he stopped again outside to help Hugh McInerney by handing him up some rolls of green-sodded scraws and slippery bundles of rushes. His long reach made him serviceable here, though his left arm was still partially disabled by the sabre cut that had invalided him. The gleam of the red coat at the Joyces' door had apparently as fascinating an effect upon Lisconnel as if the place had been inhabited by a population that bellowed and gobbled its greetings instead of saying, "How's yourself, lad?" and "It's a grand day, thank God," as it came sauntering up dispersedly from various quarters. Before many minutes had passed, quite a numerous group were collected, for in these long midsummer days there is little to be done up here except save the turf, a business which fine weather makes short work of. In the weeks before the potato digging, employment becomes as scarce as the potatoes themselves, and the hours hang limp and flaccid between the meals which punctuate them with a plateful of coarse-grained gruel. Therefore do Christy Sheridan and Terence Kilfoyle, with half a dozen of their neighbours. The sight of their distinguished visitor was an oasis in a very arid desert, and they made towards it thirstily. By and by the group drifted away from the road before the Joyces' house into the rough sward behind it. Rather literally drifted, as the cause of the move was the wind, a strong soft west wind, which had been blowing over the bog all the morning in great wide gusts. They seemed to lean hard against whatever they met, and made standing still an effort, and devastated conversation by carrying off important fragments of it uncaught, no matter how loudly one bawled. But the big boulders and furze clumps strewn about in a slight depression close by offered seats and shelter opportunely. So amongst them presently appeared Denis O'Meara's scarlet tunic, and Teresa Joyce's brown striped shawl, and Mrs. Ryan's white frilled flapping cap, which she said was being fluttered to destruction off her old head, and Hugh McInerney's many rifted caubeen, for he declared that until the flurry of the blast went down a bit, you might as well be letting on to thatch the sails whirling of a windmill. And the rest of the company following suit might be described in terms of their attire as for the most part sad-coloured and dilapidated. It was just such a gathering as may be sitting to sun themselves at Lisconnel this day, if it happens to be a fine summer one, but with a touch of brilliance, both for eye and ear, added by the young soldier's presence. They had, however, but fitful gleams to bask in, for the sky was all feathered over with little silver-white plumes, which the wind kept ruffling by so fast that the light flickered in and out continually, as if it had come through a canopy of large, slowly waving leaves. Still they gossiped beneath it with much satisfaction, and catechised Denis about his adventures, and told him all the news of the countryside. And there seemed to be no particular reason why they should not go on doing so indefinitely. But in the end broke up the assembly was a slight mishap that befell Theresa Joyce. It cannot be denied that Theresa was rather vain about her long black hair, which she had only of late begun to put up in thick silken coils. Her mother said you had to take your two hands to a one of them, like as if you were twisting a big sagawn, that is, a hay rope, and they looked almost too heavy for her small head, no matter how closely they were wound about it. A rippling wave, moreover, ran through these tresses, which were exceedingly soft and fine, so her vanity was perhaps excusable. At any rate, it led her to fashion herself a small knot of cherry-coloured ribbon, made of a bit that had trimmed the sleeve of her mother's purple merino gown. It was a very small knot, because most of the bit had gone mildewed lying up there, before Theresa grew to concern herself about such things. But it looked as bright in her hair as a ruddy berry on a dark foliaged creeper, and she wore it with a pleasure which was destined to be brief, for as she sat knitting with the quietly creeping fingers of an expert in that art, a vagrant gust maliciously whisked off her little gaud, and tossing it contumeliously on the ground as if it were not worth carrying, began to puff it along, skimming over the heather and tussocks. Denis O'Meara all but rescued it for her, only that Hugh McInerney, the omadhaun, starting forward at the same time, blundered up against him and tumbled with him into a furze bush, and before they picked themselves up, the cherry-coloured knot had met its fate in the shape of Ryan's black and white kid. She was tethered close by, and had been apparently absorbed in scratching her forehead with her left hind foot in a way that said much for the limberness of her youthful joints. But as the bit of ribbon flirted past her, she made a rapid snatch and swallowed it in a gulp. Mrs. Ryan stood dismayed at possible serious consequences to the kid, and Theresa at the certain loss of her scrap of finery. And everybody else was saying to Hugh McInerney, "Och, you great omadhaun, why couldn't you keep yourself easy? He had it safe enough only for you getting under his feet." Everybody, that is, except Denis O'Meara, who said, "Sure now, the both of us wasn't minding rightly where we was charging to, and the reason of that belike was the neither of us thinking so much of what was running after as of who we was running for, and small blame to us bedad." But Hugh's self-esteem was not restored by the good-natured excuse. "Truth it is, I'd a right to ha' stayed quiet, for the only notion I had was putting meself forward to be getting a hould of it before any of the others," and he walked off crestfallen to resume his perch on the thatch. As for Theresa, she ignored Denis's pretty speech, and said 'deed now she remembered her mother had bid her step up and see what way Ody Rafferty's aunt was that morning, and she too withdrew from the group to make this visit of inquiry. As she passed on her way under the place where you was thatching, he dropped a small handful of rushes on her head to call her attention, and when she looked up she saw his red brick-hued face in a wild tow-coloured halo peering down at her from over the eaves. "I am sorry I lost it on you," he said. "Ah, no matter about it. It wasn't your fault more than another's," said Theresa. "You'd 'a' had it now," said Hugh, "if it wasn't for the little goat gettin' the chance to eat it while himself was tumblin' over me. But I'd a lief have your hair the way it is now. It is the blackest ever I seen. One might think you'd gathered it out of the middles of them red poppies there. Stick a couple of them in it if you want anything, but to my mind it's better without. Only if you've the fancy to be tryin' the bit of red string through it, I'm sorry it was ate." Hugh's head drew back and disappeared from her view, but next moment she heard him saying mournfully, "What am I after doin'? Puttin' me foot that far down a hole it's cost fast between a couple of rafters, firm it is begorra. If I don't mind what I'm at, it's pullin' the half of their house down and wrenchin' me angle I'll be before I free myself." And she saw him struggling cautiously on the roof, all the while she was ascending the slope to Ody Rafferty's door, within which his aunt was at present a prisoner. A reluctant and repining one she was, having been seized with a bad attack of lumbago at a time when she felt particularly anxious to keep a vigilant eye upon what occurred in her neighbourhood, instead of being left dependent upon hearsay for a knowledge of anything happening outside her four draughty walls. Many a care-infested hour she fretted away between them, for how could she tell with what insidious steps the calamity to ensue from Ody's courtship of Theresa Joyce might all the while be stealing on her. She dared not confide her fears to any neighbour, nor would she have put much faith in the report of observation unwetted thereby, and she lived in daily dread of hearing the news announced as no mere conjecture or rumour, but as a very hard fact. As the days wore on, the idea took possession of her more and more completely, but she could only wreak her helpless ill humour by doing foolish and futile things, such as dilating to Ody upon the imprudence of getting married, and the undesirable qualities of black-looking slips of colleens, a simple and ingenious expedient for putting him out of conceit with all and any of them, while she assumed towards Theresa a demeanour so glum and repellent that the girl could not attribute it entirely to the irritability caused by rheumatic twinges, and from one of her charitably intentioned visits returned with a disconcerted expression and a resolve which she kept to pay no more. But in fact Ody was during these weeks even more than usually engrossed by the affairs of the inobtrusive little manufactory, which he and Felix O'Beirne superintended away in a retired part of the bog. And not they alone, but Lisconnel collectively had been going through some excitement on this account. This was occasioned by the livelier interest which the police had recently manifested in that branch of home industry, stimulated by admonitions from their authorities to the effect that the hunting down of illicit stills and confiscation of the produce might with advantage be carried on more energetically. Hence had resulted several appearances in Lisconnel of the constabulary from Ballybrosna and other stations, and when these occurred Ody was in his element of wiles and stratagems. More than once he enjoyed the moment of their visitor's departure on a wild goose chase. "Consaitin' they've got us by the hind leg this time for certain." And long did he chuckle over the evening when they came and sat discoursin' as pleasant and easy as a rabbit in its hole, by a hearth where there was enough of the stuff to float a lot of them lying within 6 inches of their shiny brogues. It was, however, thought expedient to guard against a repetition of this perilous entertainment. The contraband crocks were transferred to a still more secluded hiding place in the queer, tiny, sod and stone shanty with Hugh McInerney, who had displayed unexpected strategical ability and presence of mind under the late emergencies, now knocked up for himself in a hollow behind the hill. So old Moggy's fears might have been better employed. Then, about this time too, a thrill was caused by the mysterious horseman who visited the O'Beirnes' forge one night, and got old Felix to break open for him an immensely strong, small iron box which he carried. The same box being found next morning lying empty in the little Lisconnel stream, beside which the horse, a grand big roan, was quietly grazing, while his rider was nowhere, nor was ever after anywhere, to be seen. An incident which gave scope for infinite speculation at Lisconnel. All these things happened before Ody's aunt got about again. By that time it was well on in August, and the season having been hot and dry, Lisconnel's oat patches were already reflecting, as if in a mirror, tarnished somewhat and rusted, the broad golden blaze that had looked down on them so steadily, and people had begun to think about reaping. And Ryan's fields indeed were so ripe by the day of Ballyrosner's big fair, that Paddy Ryan commissioned Hugh McInerney to bring him back a reaping hook from it. Hugh was going to attend it on business of his own, and Ody Rafferty had some bulkier commissions to execute in behalf of his neighbours. But he encountered some difficulties in getting under way, due to the inopportune devices of old Rory, whom he proposed to bring with him. Ody had been careful not to put on his best clothes until he had caught the beast, because, as he remarked, he well knew the creature would be off with himself hidin' in the unhandiest place the devil 'ud put in his mind, if he noticed ever a decent stitch on him. Yet despite this precaution, when his master went to look for him after breakfast, no black pony was in sight. "And he that'll be foosterin' everywhere under your feet otherwhiles he's that fond of company," said Ody's aunt, who hobbled out of doors for the first time to assist in the search. "Belike he's seen you rubbin' up your brogues, and be reason of that he took off wid himself. Bedad now, the big ould head of him is as full of deceit as it can hold." "He's a notorious schemer, God forgive him," Ody said, rather sadly, for it went against the grain with him to admit defects in Rory. But his scheming bade fair to prove successful, as Ody, after long hunting, stood baffled at the door, with his expedition seemingly frustrated, when Hugh McInerney, passing by, reported that he was after seeing the beast leaning gathered up close agin the back of the big stone above there, wid a contented grin on the old gob of him, that 'ud frighten you wid the villainy was in it. Whereupon the two young men went to dislodge him from his fool's paradise, and the three started together without further delay. Till a short way down the road they met old Felix O'Beirne, and with him Denis O'Meara, at whose heels followed Joe Egan. Ragged and small, his habit being to dog his splendid cousin so persistently that old Mrs. Byers next door said she wondered the young chap didn't of an odd while take him be the two shoulders and sling him over the dyke. "So you're off to the fair," said old O'Beirne, "and is it sellin' the pony you to be at last?" "Sure now, he'll be the pick of the market, that's certain." "Ah, they'll never give me me price for him, the naygurs," said Ody. "Our Captain Commander here had a right to take him off of you for a trooper," said old O'Beirne, "and faix, there wouldn't be his equal in the length and breadth of the army. What 'ud you offer for him, lad? Look at the size of the head he has on him, and the unnatural white face of him that's fit to scare a regiment before it if there was nothin' else." "Is it broke bankrupt you'd have me then?" said Denis, "settin' up to be buyin' meself mounts of that expensive description?" Musha, good gracious, man, promise him the first threepenny bit you meet floatin' down the river on a grindstone, and you'll be buyin' every hair in his tail," said the old man. "But come along, and don't be delayin' him. They're goin' after fairin's for their sweethearts, the way you'd be yourself if you weren't too great a naygur. Or maybe there isn't anything good enough for her to be had in Ballybrosna? Is that the reason of it?" Little Joe was beginning to say in a resentful shout, "Naygur yourself, he and I are goin' to get—" but Denis pulled him on jocularly by the collar, and the parties went their several ways. Ody then said, "Sweethearts, is it? He's the queer old man for talkin'. Glory be to the great goodness, I'm troubled wid ne'er a one. Here's out of it, says I. Unnatural, says he, musha cock him up, and himself showin' old garoons all the days of his life. Hie along, Rory Jewel." But Hugh said meditatively, and more than half to himself, which was rather a habit of his, "Well now, for the matter of fairin', it's just the best length of ribbon I can get them to give me for a shillin'. Yella it's to be. I wasn't long either plannin' away to find out the colour she'd like. Sure I'd give her a bunch of flowers wid poppies in it, and daisies, and furze blossom, and foxglove, and forget-me-not, and meadow sweet, and says I to her, which of them was the finest colour? And says she, the furze blossom was, be reason of it bein' the bright gold all over, that the others had mostly only a spark of somewheres inside. So it's to be yella. Tellin' you the truth, I'd liefer she wouldn't be wearin' e'er such a thing at all. Anyways, not in her hair. That's a sight purtier just in the big black twists. But sure it's the fancy she has, and more betoken, I think bad of me lettin' the little goat swally the weeny bit she had on her. Ay, bedad, I'd a right to be bringin' it to her, and at all events I'd be doin' a foolish thing to come home widout it, and me not gettin' the bit of fat bacon these 6 weeks next Saturday to make up the price. I wonder now what len'th they'd give me for 1 shillin'." But Ody, who had not been listening, only said oracularly, "Och, that's accordin'," which did not materially assist Hugh's speculations. Yellow ribbons were not plentiful at Ballybrosna fair, and Hugh McInerney had to ask for them vainly at several stalls before he came to an old clothes cart, where the proprietress, being hot and cross, took him aback by replying, "And who ever heard tell of sellin' ribbons by the length, you queer lookin' stookawn?" "Sure it's meself couldn't say, but you might. I never had any call to be buyin' such a thing before. But a bit that 1 shillin' 'ud be the price of is what I'm wishful to be gettin' if it was yella. And beggin' your pardon, ma'am," Hugh answered with a glib meekness which mollified the old woman as much as his not undesigned mention of his shilling. "So," she said, "'deed now, I believe I've a splendid yella bit somewheres, a trifle creased in the folds, but I could make you a present of for a shillin'." And she rummaged and unrolled before her interminable coils of vivid dandelion-hued ribbon. "The grand colour of it couldn't be bet," she said, "in Ireland. You could see it a mile off, and you wouldn't get the match of it in Dublin under half a crown. If she wouldn't be pleased with that, you've got an odd one to satisfy." Ody with Rory came by as she was wrapping it up in paper, and Hugh, pointing to his purchase with a melancholy air, said in an aggrieved tone, "It's a terrible quantity they're about givin' me, yards and yards, enough to rope round a haystack, and it's an ojis colour. Troth now, if she takes the notion to be stickin' the whole of it on top of her little black head of her, it's an object she'll make of herself, she will so. It's a pity. I'd liefer there hadn't been the half of it." "What for then are you gettin' more than enough of whatever it is?" Ody asked, not unreasonably. "Supposin' you wanted any such trash at all? Ah, sure I settled in me own mind to be spendin' me shillin' on it, and that's the way it is," Hugh said resignedly. "Maybe she'll have more wit, the bit of a crathur. She might never put it on. So now I've only to see after Paddy Ryan's rapin' hook, and then I'm done. And as it is carryin' them 2 bags all the way home you'd be, sure there's plenty of room for them on the beast." "Aye, is there?" said Ody. "But the fact is, Rory's in none too good a temper this minute, goodness help him, and he'll be apt to be thravellin' more content, the crathur, if he sees he's not the only body wid a loadin'." "Reach me over the one of them," said Hugh. "I've nought barrin' the bit of ribbon, and the reapin' hook'll be nothin' to me at all." And in this way they plodded back to Lisconnel. Chapter 6. A Fairing. Up at Lisconnel, meanwhile, as the idle hours loitered by, Ody Rafferty's aunt grew tired of her solitary housekeeping, and late in the afternoon she made her way down as far as the Joyces'. Here a number of the neighbours were sitting about in almost the same place where Theresa had sustained the loss of her cherry-coloured knot. But to-day there were no rough breezes stirring to bring about such disasters by their unmannerly pranks. The sun-steeped air was so still that the thick bushes stood as steady as the boulders, and even the rushes nodded slightly and stiffly. As the old woman hobbled down the slope, she saw Denis O'Meara's scarlet uniform gleaming martially against a background of dark broom and hoary rock. Its wearer was, however, very peacefully employed in pulling the silky floss off the heads of the bog cotton, which lay in a great heap before him on a flat-topped boulder, with a big bunch of many-hued wild flowers beside it. Theresa Joyce, who sat opposite him, was pulling bog cotton too, though less diligently, for it might have been noticed that she often looked off her work and toward the scrap of road that lay within her ken. Joe Egan was at his cousin's elbow, and a few other lads and lasses made a rough circle. But old Mrs. Joyce and old Mrs. Ryan and old Paddy Ryan and old Felix O'Beirne had established themselves on a low grassy bank at a little distance. It was kept so closely cropped by Ryan's goat that its dandelions grew dwarfed and stalkless, and were set flat on the fine sward like mock suns. All this day the real sun had shone on it so strongly that the air was aromatic with the odour of its dim-blossomed herbs, and to touch it was like laying your hand on the warm side of some sleek-coated beast. Old Paddy said you might think you were sitting on the back of an old cow, but his wife rejoined that you'd have to go far enough from Lisconnel, worse luck, before you get the chance of doing such a thing. And she shook her head over the reflection so regretfully that a matter-of-fact person might have inferred her to have been formerly much in the habit of enjoying seats on the backs of cows. These elders, from where they sat, commanded a comprehensive view of the crops of Lisconnel, its potatoes and oats, green and gold, meshed in their grey stone fences, and flecked with obstructive boulders and laboured cairns. In the middle of Ryan's neighbouring field there is a block of quartzite, as big as a small turf sack, which gleamed exceedingly white from amongst the deep muffling greenery of potato plants. Mrs. Joyce had been praising their thriving aspect to old Paddy, who, however, was disposed to express a gloomy view of them. "It's too rank they're growin' altogether," he said. "Ne'er a big crop you'll ever get under that height of holms. Heavy thatchin' and light liftin', as the sayin' is." To Felix O'Beirne the smooth leafy surface recalled a far-off incident of the war, when the dense foliage of a certain potato field had permitted the execution of a curious military manoeuvre. It was one of old O'Beirne's favourite stories, and he often related it at full length, but to-day it was cut short by the arrival of Ody Rafferty's aunt, whom Mrs. Joyce and Mrs. Ryan were prompt to greet, making room for her between them on the bank with an alacrity which somehow conveyed an impression of uneasiness, lest she should establish herself elsewhere. "And what at all is Theresa busy wid over yonder, and young O'Meara? Is it bogberries they're after pullin'?" Mrs. Joyce said, "No, ma'am, it isn't bogberries," and left further explanations to Mrs. Ryan, with the air of one who refrains from self-glorification, but counts upon its being done for her, more gracefully, by deputy. "Sure wasn't he out on the bog the length of the day, since early this mornin', he and little Joe gatherin' her the bog cotton?" said Mrs. Ryan. "The full of a pitaty creel he brought her, they have it there in a heap." "'Twas because he heard her sayin' last night she wished she had a good bit of it to stuff the pillow she's makin'," put in Mrs. Joyce. "Off he went after it the first thing this mornin'." "Whethen now, is that the way of the win'?" said Ody Rafferty's aunt, with a pleased smile, striking out unfamiliar paths among her wrinkles. "Troth, but I'm rael glad to hear it. Bedad, it's a grand thing for little Theresa." "He's a very dacint poor lad," Mrs. Joyce said, looking over with pride at the handsome young sergeant, and thinking that Ody Rafferty's aunt must have some good nature in her after all, since she was so evidently glad of their good luck. "'Deed, but there's not a finer young man in the kingdom of Connaught this day," said Mrs. Ryan, who could of course be frankly laudatory, "and wid everybody's good word, high and low, and drawin' grand pay, and the Colonel in his regiment ready to do a turn for him any time, and a rael steady kind-hearted lad to the back of that. But sure he's after as nice a little girl as he had found anywheres wid all his travellin', and as good as gold. He'll be very apt to be spakin' out to her presently, for it's gettin' near his leave's end, and what for would they be waitin'? But to my mind it's as good as made up after what he's done to day." In a little while after this, Ody Rafferty's aunt slipped away and set off hobbling along the road toward Duffclane. She wanted to intercept her grand nephew on his way home and tell him this news, for all day she had been haunted by an apprehension that Ody meant to return with a fairing for Theresa, the presentation of which might bring about a crisis in his courtship very disastrous from her own point of view. Old Moggy surveyed her world rather steadily at all times from that particular outlook, finding in her solitary superfluousness little to deflect her gaze. The disappointment which, on her own theory, these tidings would bring to Ody did not do so now, and she put her best foot foremost, animated by the pleasure of telling some new thing, one moreover that threw a reassuring light upon her situation. With even her amended opinion of the lad, she could hardly imagine that he would have a chance against magnificent Denis O'Meara, whom nobody would have ever expected to look for a wife in poor little Lisconnel. But you never could tell, and she felt that it still behoved her to be on her guard against all possible perils. Therefore she at present thought it expedient to waylay Ody, and let him know that if he had any notion of Theresa Joyce, he was a day after the fair. Hobbling on bent and breathless, wrapped in her rusty black shawl, with her shadow flitting far out over the level bog amid the slanted beams, she looked a not inappropriate messenger of woe, symbolically impotent and insignificant, a little dark speck in the wide westering light, a feeble stir of life creeping on the verge of a vast silent solitude, and full withal of baseless fears and futile plots concerning the withered shred of existence that remained to her. She was just in the nick of time, she said to herself, when she saw the trio presently come up over the top of the hill. Ody was pointing out conciliatingly to the morose Rory how they'd be at home now nearly in the time he'd be wagging his tail, and Hugh McInerney was resolving that he would go on straight to his own place, and defer the presentation of the ugly yellow ribbon until tomorrow. All three were hot and fagged and dusty. "Well, lad, and what's the best news wid you?" Ody's aunt said to him as they met. "Little enough," said Ody. "And you comin' out of a fair," she said. "Bedad, now, we make a better offer at it ourselves up here for the matter of news." "What's that at all?" said Ody. "Sure, amn't I just after hearin' tell of a grand weddin' there's goin' to be presently?" said his aunt. "And that doesn't happen every day of the year." "Och, a wedding!" said Ody. "I was thinkin' maybe there was something quare at our little place beyant yonder. But as long as it's nothin' worse than weddin's you're hearin' tell of, I'm content, if you listened the 2 ears off your head. It's Denis O'Meara and Theresa Joyce has made a match of it," said his aunt, conscious that she was slightly overstating facts. "Settled up it is only this evenin', and the weddin's bound to be before his leave's out. So there's for you." "Sure good luck to the both of them," said Ody. "Theresa Joyce is a pleasant little being, I'll say that for her, and divil a bit of harm there is in O'Meara either. A fine chap he is for a soldier. Not that they're any great things as far as I can see, just police a trifle smartened up." Ody's thoughts were for the moment running on the police, a couple of whom he had lately espied at a short distance coming across the bog. "Well, if you wanted to see the 2 of them," said his aunt, raising her voice as he began to drive Rory on, "there they are, just at the back of her place, sortin' the stuff he's after gettin' her on the bog. He brought her the full of a pitaty creel. Her mother's as pleased over it as anything, and sot up 2 eyes, she bedad." The old woman was for the time being almost as much disappointed as relieved by the equanimity with which Ody had received her tidings. Yet if she had but known, they had not failed to produce a strong sensation. Only she never thought of considering how they might affect that queer big gawk, Hugh McInerney. What did occur to her in this connection, as he began to trudge alongside her after the pony, was that he was as ugly as if he had been bespoke, for Hugh's long tramp under the sultry sun had scorched him a deeper and more uniform red brick than usual, and his shock of tow-coloured hair jutting from beneath an unnoticeable round cap looked more than ever like thatch over his blinking blue eyes. When they had gone a few yards in silence, he suddenly said musingly: "I dunno why he wouldn't have as good a right to be bringin' her anything she had a fancy for off the bog in a pitaty creel as me to be buyin' her len'ths of hijeous coloured ribbons to make a show of herself wid. But all the same, I'd as lief he'd let it alone. For some reason or other, I've a wish in me mind I was slingin' the whole of it into one of them bog holes out there. That'd be no thing to go to on her." And that was a queer story the old woman had about them gettin' married. Somebody was apt to be making a fool of her. Who was it would be tellin' her, I wonder? But old Moggy partly overheard and said: "And them that knew what they was talkin' about, supposin' it's any affair of yours?" So he did the rest of his meditating inaudibly. He said to himself that he was stepping home straight, continuing the while to walk in quite the opposite direction, and that he wouldn't be going to the Joyces' place to night at all. What'd bring him there, and it getting so late? But of course he went there as surely as a swimming bubble goes over the cataract's smooth lip, or a fascinated little bird down the snake's throat. For the sensation which he had begun to experience, and which was a strong one and strange to him, was nothing less than jealousy. He was jealous of that pitaty creel. When he came to the place Ody's aunt had told of, he found a group of young Joyces and Ryans and others gathered among the boulders and bushes in a circle, of which the heap of bog cotton formed the centre. And a glance having showed him that it included Denis and Theresa, he sat down facing them and said to himself: If I'd ha' known now it was bog cotton she was wantin', I could ha' been gatherin' out plenty last night after I come home. There's a grand big moon these times, wid lashin's and lavins of light to be gettin' them kind of glimmerin' things by. I seen a black place below between the thrane of water and roadside all waved over white wid it, like as if it was a fall of snow tryin' could it flutter off away wid itself again out of the world. I'd have gotten her enough to fill a 6-foot sack. What for didn't the creature tell me? Pursuing these and other such reflections, Hugh's attention, which at other times had a long tether, strayed far afield. He did not hear Denis O'Meara inquire of him twice whether Ody Rafferty had got his fine price for the old pony. Not yet Peter Ryan rejoined after an interval that he supposed it was such a big one. Anyway, Hugh McInerney couldn't get it out of his mouth. That was sizable enough. No doubt it was this symptom of absent-mindedness that emboldened Thady Joyce to set about twitching out of Hugh's pocket the flimsy paper parcel seen protruding from it, a feat which he achieved undetected, while his surrounding accomplices nudged one another and whispered, "Och, he has it now. Whoa, he'll do it." Thady conveyed that he had filched to Molly and Nelly Ryan, who manipulated it for some time amid much giggling, and then Nelly, with dexterous audacity, pinned their handiwork on to the cap of her neighbour Denis O'Meara, who sat all unawares. Thus it came to pass that when Hugh was at last roused to a vague sense of tittering all around him, which reached him much as the clacking chirp of sparrows gets meaninglessly into our frayed morning dreams, and looking up out of his reverie stared about him for an explanation, the first thing his eyes lit on was Denis's smart cap, surmounted by a mass of gaudy yellow ribbon in immense bows and loops and streamers, flapping and waggling absurdly at every movement made by their unsuspecting wearer. And the spectacle caught his breath and dazzled his sight with a sudden scorching blast of wrath, for it seemed to him that Denis was not making merely a mock of him and his faring, which he thought intrinsically of small amount, but through it of Theresa herself and her foolish little fancies. And there sat Theresa looking on with a quick pink flush and shining eyes and a quiver about her mouth. The next moment Hugh had hurled at the bedizened cap that he happened to be holding in his hand, and this was Paddy Ryan's new reaping hook. Thereupon followed a terrible confusion and clamour, which seemed to fill at a sweep all the spacious drowsy light of the sun setting. For the missile had gone surely to its mark, and had not simply knocked off Denis's cap, but made a shocking gash in his temple, so that there was only too sufficient reasons for the rising shrieks of "Holy Virgin, he's murdered, he's kilt." Amid all the turmoil, with Denis fallen on the ground, and Hugh standing staring, and everybody else rushing through other like crows in a storm, one person alone appeared to act with a definite purpose, and that was little Joe Egan. The event had made him like one possessed with rage and despair. To Joe, weakly and timorous and not over wise, his valiant, handsome, good-natured soldier cousin had come as the most splendid apparition that had shined upon him in the dim course of his 15 years, and he had spent the past 3 months in adoring it devoutly. So that now to see him laid low suddenly in this savage fashion was a sight that might well cause a burning thirst for vengeance upon the miscreant who had dealt the stroke. Joe generally had to get his revenges wreaked by deputy, and now, as he darted away, his intention was to find the police somewhere, and bring them to take up the great beastie murdering devil Hugh McInerney, and if by any means possible get him hung. He attained his object sooner than might have been expected, as not far down the road a pair of constables were run into by a small tatterdemalion figure, who, choking and stammering, and writhing in an ague fit of fury, proceeded to inform them that big Hugh McInerney was just after murdering Denis O'Meara up above there, taking the head off him with a rapine hook, and further, that if they looked in the dirty thief's little place at the foot of the hill, they'd find that every other stone in the walls of it was nothing else but a crock of poteen. This was the cause of the police's prompt arrival on the scene, where nobody resented Joe's action. Denis's injury, though so grave, happily did not seem to be mortal. In fact, on this occasion young Dan O'Byrne, albeit scarcely more than a spalpeen, displayed a handiness and resource about bandaging and other remedies, which foreshadowed his future reputation throughout the district for knowledgeableness in surgery and medicine. Hugh McInerney was, of course, at once arrested, without any resistance on his part, or any sympathy from the indignant neighbours. He appeared to be what old Will Sheridan termed fallen into serious consternation, and was heard to make only one remark. It was when people were saying that Theresa Joyce had took a weakness and her brothers had carried her indoors. "Och, the crathur," he said, "and it might aisy have hit her, very aisy. Meself's the queer divil." Once the police and their prisoner had gone, Denis having been brought into the Ryans' house, a deep and melancholy hush settled down upon Lisconnel, as if a murky wing had flapped out its brief flare of excitement. The whole thing had happened so quickly that the rich light from the west was still bronzing the edges of the flat-ledged furze boughs and rosing their white stems, when the little hollow behind the Joyces' house rested quiet and deserted, with no traces left of the company lately there assembled, except a litter of silky white bog cotton tufts, soon to be swept away by the breeze, and the unchancy yellow ribbon which had been torn out of Denis's cap and lay coiling among the rough grass, whence, as the dusk thickened, it glinted like the wraith of a lost sunbeam, or a ray from an evil star. But that night fell very dark, with the moon so closely veiled that the flaggers and bulrushes, waving their swords and spears fast by, dwindled into mere rustlings and murmurs. The air was full of them. At the dimmest hour, anybody who had stolen out of a neighbouring door and passed between the faintly glimmering white boulders, as if in search of something lost there, might have seemed only one of the whispering shadows, and these might have begun to say, "Sorra aught can I do at all, and ne'er a soul is there to speak a word. All of them agin him, and it no fault of his when he would be tormented that way. They'd no call to go play such a trick on him, and he didn't mean it a purpose, I very well know. But the other chap was intendin' to annoy him, sittin' there wid a great ugly grin on his face. I wish he'd never come next or nigh Lisconnel." But be that as it may, when the next morning's light twinkled among the dewy blades, the yellow ribbon had disappeared. After this the days seemed to drag heavily at Lisconnel, where a dullness and flatness had come over society. Dr. Hamilton had carried off Denis O'Meara to Ballybrosna, and there was nothing to fill up the blank he left except speculations about his chances of recovery and censures upon Hugh McInerney, monotonously unanimous. In his favour, indeed, no one seemingly had a word to say. People declared that they'd never have thought he'd take and do such a thing, for though he might have been a quare sort of bosthoon, he was always decent and peaceable. But cancelled praise is the bitterest of blame, and they added that it was real outrageous of him to go do murder on the likes of Denis O'Meara, and no credit to Lisconnel for it to be happening him there. Illian characters it'd be giving them if it went back to the regiment wid his eyes slashed out of his head, as much as to say he hadn't a fair chance among us unless he'd come wid his side arms. The neighbours were of opinion, too, that it was no wonder little Theresa Joyce had got a bit moped and quiet, after her sweetheart being as good as destroyed before her eyes, and it hard to say if she'd ever see a sight of him again. It was a misfortunate thing, Mrs. Conryan remarked one day, when the subject was under discussion, that young O'Meara hadn't actually spoke out before it happened him. 'Twould ha' made her a deal easier in her mind now, I wouldn't wonder. Because the way the matter stands, he might take up wid some different notion, and just be off wid himself like a cloud blown out of the sky, and she couldn't be saying a word if she was ever so sure of what he was intending. Young Mrs. Kehoe, to whom she made the observation, refused to entertain this view, and replied, "Sorra a fear is there of that. It was easy to see he had gone to the well of the world's end after her, let alone steppin' up from the town, if he's spared to get his health. Aye, he'll be comin' back for her one of these fine days, sure enough, please God." But the fulfilment of her confident prediction looked several degrees more doubtful in the light of one of the two pieces of news which Mrs. Carbery, accompanied by her daughter Rose, conveyed to the Joyces on a bright September morning a short while after. Her son had come home with it from the town too late the night before. One of them was Hugh McInerney, who had been awaiting the assizes in Moynalone jail, had died of the fever there on last Friday. There was nothing very surprising in this event, as Hugh's open-air life could have but ill acclimatised him to the atmosphere of the unclean little jail, and it was not likely to be very deeply deplored at Lisconnel, where he had not been known long, nor, as we have seen, much to his advantage. As Mrs. Carbery sat in the three-cornered arm-chair, with the sun-dazzle off a burnished mug on the dresser shimmering into her eyes and making her blink quaintly, she said, with rather severe solemnity, that she hoped the young fellow had had time to repent of his sins, or else it was very apt to be a bad look-out for him, and he after comin' widin a shavin' of taking another man's life no time at all ago, so to speak. Ne'er a chance but it would be clear in everybody's recollection. Mrs. Joyce, however, said, "Ah, sure, maybe the crathur wasn't intendin' any such great harm all the while, God be good to him. And anyway, where he's gone he'll find plenty ready to be speaking up for him, and puttin' the best face they can on the matter." "Ay, will he," said old Biddy Ryan, who was calling too, "and bedad it's one great differ there is, be all accounts, between that place and this. For here if a misfort'nit body does aught amiss, the first notion the rest of us have, God forgive us, is to be axin' what worser he was manin', like as if it was some manner of riddle that there's bound to be an answer to, if one could find it." "'Deed, and I dunno if they haven't very far to look, ma'am," said Mrs. Carbery with dignity, "when a chap does his endeavours to take the head off another man with a reapin' hook, ma'am." "And I dunno, ma'am, for that matter," said old Biddy, also with dignity, "if it's any such a great deal better to have one's mind took up wid inventin' other people's bad intentions than if it was wid one's own." "Ah, well, I wouldn't be thinking too bad of poor Hugh McInerney at any event," said Mrs. Joyce. "'Twas maybe a sort of accident, for he seemed a dacint crathur afore that. Och now, to think it's only a few odd weeks since he was creepin' about over our heads up there, mendin' the old thatch. You'd whiles hear him hummin' away, talkin' to himself like some sort of big bee, and in his grave to day. But isn't it a lucky thing that he's lavin' nobody belongin' to him to be breakin' their hearts frettin' after him? Theresa, dear child, you're ne'er a stim of light to be workin' in, sittin' there in the corner." But Theresa said she had light enough to blind her, and was only windin' a skein, and could see better to do that in the dark. So Mrs. Carbery passed on to her second piece of news, which, though less tragical than the first, was not likely to sound very cheerfully in the ears of some among her audience. It ran that her son Ned was after seeing Denis O'Meara down beyant, and that he was doin' finely, next door to himself again, and that the people in the town did be sayin' he was courtin' Mary Ann Nelligan, the people's daughter that he was lodgin' wid, a terrible fortin she was said to have, and that he'd be very apt to be takin' her along wid him presently when his leave was up. Mrs. Carbery supposed there were none of them very likely to see him again up at Lisconnel, and the rest of the neighbours, having heard her tale, supposed so likewise, and said among themselves that Theresa Joyce was to be pitied. Yet not many days after this, while the early autumn weather was still soft-aired and mellow-lighted over our blue-misted bogland, where the leaves and berries were brightening, and even the little frosty grey cups on the lichened boulders getting a scarlet thread on the rim, on one clear dew-dashed morning, who but Denis O'Meara himself should come stepping into Lisconnel. The neighbours who saw him go by were glad to notice that he looked as well as ever he did in his life, and he greeted them all blithely, though briefly, eluding every attempt to entangle him in conversation, and making very straight for Widow Joyce's house, which was by these same observers considered to betoken a healthy frame of mind. Only Mrs. Joyce and Mrs. Kilfoyle were in the little brown room when he arrived, but they gave him a cordial welcome, and he took a seat from which he could keep a watch on the door while they talked about different things. One of these, naturally, was the melancholy end of Denis's assistant, poor Hugh McInerney, and Mrs. Joyce said it was little enough they'd have thought a while ago that it would be Denis who'd come back. But indeed, she said, if anything had took you, we'd ha' been in no hurry ever to set eyes on the other unlucky bosthoon. Denis said, "Faith, ma'am, I'd give 6 months' pay the thing had never happened. Divil a bit of harm I believe there was in poor McInerney. And I spoke to Dr. Hamilton to spake to Mr. Nugent and the other magistrates for him. But they said after what me cousin Joe let out about the poteen at his place, the police would be wishful to keep him convenient to them for a while, and to be sure they kep' him too long altogether. I know, ma'am, young Rafferty and the rest had his shanty pulled down before the police come up next day, but they thought they'd get something out of him. The little jackass ought to have held his tongue. It was a pity, bedad. Hard times it is on a man to be losing his life, you may say, along wid his temper, just be reason of a bit of a joke." Still, as he looked out into the sunshine, he could not help thinking that he would have had a greater loss of life had poor Hugh McInerney, who, it was evident, would always have met with a cold reception from everybody at the Joyces'. Then he said to Mrs. Joyce, "And how's Theresa, ma'am?" Mrs. Joyce was in the middle of replying that she was grandly, and had just run over to Mrs. Keogh's on a message, when Theresa herself came in. Denis jumped up quickly, saying, "Ah, Theresa, it's a great while since I've seen you." But Theresa only lifted her head without turning it, and walked straight as if nobody had accosted her. "Arrah now, Theresa, darlin', don't you see Denis O'Meara?" said her mother, puzzled and rather dismayed. And then Theresa did turn and look at him. "Yes, I see him," she said, and indeed she might as easily have overlooked the red flame in a lantern as the tall scarlet lancer in her mother's little misty cornered room. "I see him," she said, "and I hate the sight of him." And thereupon she turned again and walked out of the door, leaving a dead silence behind her. This was one of the very few harsh sayings that Theresa Joyce has uttered in the course of her long life, and it came like a shock upon her hearers. Mrs. Joyce at last said blankly, "What at all has took the child?" And Bessie Kilfoyle said to Denis, who stood dumbfounded, "But indeed now, you may be sure there's not a many up here, at any rate, who do that." But he replied, "If she does, it's many enough for me, Mrs. Kilfoyle, and I won't stop here to be driving her out of the house. So I'll say good bye to yous kindly, for I'll be off to Dublin tomorrow or next day. And in coorse," Mrs. Joyce remarked ruefully, after he had departed, retreading his steps through the bright fresh morning with so crestfallen a mien that all the neighbours knew things had not run smoothly. You couldn't reasonably expect him to stay here to be hated the sight of, and indeed, what with one thing and another, it's none too good treatment the poor lad's got up at Lisconnel, more's the pity." Theresa herself never had any explanation to offer of why she would be that cross with poor Denis O'Meara. Her mother accounted for it by pique at the Carberys' ill-timed gossip about his imaginary courtship of Mary Ann Nelligan, and Mrs. Kilfoyle was for a while inclined to the same opinion, until one day by chance she espied in the little old tin box which contained Theresa's treasures a roll of bright yellow ribbon wrapped up very carefully, and thenceforward she silently ceased to hope that things might all come right yet, if Denis O'Meara came back again on leave. So, although Mrs. Joyce may have drawn wrong inferences, the results were much as she had foreseen. Theresa never married, and when her mother died she went to live with her brother Mick at Larrigmena, where she is still living still, notwithstanding that it is so long since all this happened. Since the fine summer when Denis O'Meara was at Lisconnel, and Hugh McInerney, who luckily left nobody to be breaking their hearts fretting after him, died in Moynalone jail. The yellow ribbon lies safely in her box, and with it a grimy bit of paper, brought to her one day by a trusty hand, to which Hugh found out a way of committing it before he was took bad entirely. Theresa herself has never deciphered its wild scrawls, being an unlettered person, but its bearer read it over to her until she knew it by heart, every word. "For your own self the yellow ribbon is," the letter ran, "but don't be wearing it unless you like it. And I'm sorry the man got hit, but I do be dreamin' most nights that it's you I'm after reapin' the little head off of. And I'd liefer lose my life than think I'd be after hurtin' a hair of it. But the devil was busy wid me that evenin', and I'm very apt never to get the chance to set foot again out on the big bog. It'd do me heart good to see the sun goin' down in it a great way off, for this is a quare small place. It's a long while, but sure to the end of all the days of me life," it said to her like an echo beaten back from the walls of the great abysm, "it's of yourself I'll be thinking off away in contentment at Lisconnel." Section 5